So in Matthew, you've got this weird passage in Matthew 10 where he talks about, and I'll just quote it here from the NIV, brother will betray brother to death. And a father, this is verse 21 in chapter 10, and a father his child, children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. When you are persecuted in one place, flee to another. Truly I tell you, you will not finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes.
This is Derek Lambert, host of the MythVision podcast, and today we're going to be listening in and responding to comments made by Derek and his guest, Dr. Bart Ehrman. Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the BLOGCAST. I am Triggerman1976, and on this episode, we're going to be interacting with a recent appearance by Bart Ehrman on the MythVision podcast with Derek Lambert. And Derek likes to paint himself as someone who's driven by curiosity and claims to have been a believer. But he's someone who's drifted from denomination to denomination, from theological position to theological position. My experience with such people is that either they were never converted to begin with, or they never actually had a firm theological foundation from which to build. Now, you might say, well, Triggerman, you've admitted to changing denominations and theological positions, and I have to say you're correct. I have. But this has come from my study of Scripture and not because of me not having a foundation on which to believe. But I digress. On today's episode, we're going to be listening in and responding to comments made by Derek and Bart Ehrman, who is the James A. Distinguished Professor of Religion at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Ehrman, of course, is a well-known, well-established apostate who touts himself as an expert on the New Testament and early Christianity. He's written a number of books, probably best known for books such as Misquoting Jesus and the list escapes my mind. It's long, distinguished. You can look it up yourself. But before we get into this video, I just want to say thank you to my subscribers. I'm almost at 250. I appreciate each and every one of you. And if you appreciate what I'm doing and you would like to have some way to support me, the best way that you can do that is to purchase a copy of my debut novel, A Turning of Shadow. It's an action thriller. It's available in both paperback and Kindle. One reader has said it is very similar to books written by W.E.B. Griffin. You know who that is. The link is in the description. Now, that being said, back to the video. In this part of the video, we find ourselves in a section where Derek and Bart are discussing the text of Matthew chapter 10, specifically statements made by Jesus as he's sending out his apostles on their missionary journey.
So in Matthew, you've got this weird passage in Matthew 10 where he talks about, and I'll just quote it here from the NIV, brother will betray brother to death. And a father, this is verse 21 in chapter 10, and a father his child, children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. When you are persecuted in one place, flee to another. Truly I tell you, you will not finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. I interpret this as something that was expected that never happened, that was not fulfilled. It looks like a fossil, so to speak, of an earlier idea that may come from the actual, I guess, an earlier gospel, I would say maybe Q, or an earlier source. Does this look like failed apocalyptic expectations to you?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, he's talking to his disciples, and he's talking about how they're going to be persecuted, right? And so they're going to be dragged in front of governors and kings, you know, and they have to bear testimony to non-Jews. And so he's talking about, it's a little bit weird because earlier in that, I can't remember if you quoted this part, but in verse 18 where it says you're going to be dragged before Gentiles, but then he says you won't go through all the towns of Israel before before the Son of Man comes. And so it looks like there's maybe been different things spliced together here, maybe different sayings spliced together.
Different sayings spliced together. Bart seems to be under the impression that the writers of the Gospels had tape recorders or were directly transcribing actual speeches rather than crafting complex literary works that adhere to the standards of the literary genre known as bioi. Now, for a greater discussion of this, you can read Richard Burridges' book, What Are the Gospels? But in another of Burridges' work, Four Gospels, One Jesus, of Matthew 10, he notes, through this sermon, Matthew draws parallels between Jesus' task and the disciples' task. So the missionary instructions passed on to the church down through time. But we continue.
The idea seems to be the disciples are going to go out and preach throughout the towns of Israel, and before they're finished, the end will have come. I'll say, you probably know this, but this was a key verse for Albert Schweitzer in his quest to the historical Jesus, because he said it goes back to Jesus. Jesus really said this verse, and he really did expect that the Son of Man would arrive before evangelism of Israel had finished. But then the disciples returned to Jesus, and the Son of Man had not arrived. That is what made Jesus decide that he himself had to suffer the messianic woes. For Schweitzer, that's why Jesus decided to go to the cross, because that would force God's hand. And so it's a key verse for Schweitzer. But he also understands it as a failed apocalyptic expectation. And I think that's probably right. I think it probably does go back to Jesus, or close to his time anyway. And that's a prediction that didn't happen.
Is that what Jesus says, though? Is Jesus making a prediction? The problem with that idea is that Jesus is making a prediction, strictly speaking, is the form of the verb used in the text, which is relevant because of a passage that we'll come to later in the same discussion. But the form of the verb used in Matthew 10 when Jesus says to his disciples in the NIV, you will not finish going through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. The verb that gets translated comes is in the aorist subjunctive. Now, while the NIV appears to give it a futuristic implication, in the original language, the implication is one of continuous action that started at some point in the past and continues onward. And there's also the fact that the verb gets translated comes, while it can refer to relocation from one place to another, like you've come from your house to your buddy's house. In regards to person, it can refer to a personal presentation, like you've walked out onto a stage. Leon Morris, in his Pillar Series commentary on this passage, notes that it's not easy to see what the coming of the Son of Man could mean here. But he does go on to say, the coming normally brings us into the sphere of eschatology and refers to the second coming. While it's not impossible to hold that Jesus referred to it on occasion to this coming, that does not seem to be what is in mind here. The real question is, what did Matthew mean by invoking this here? By not using the future indicative, which is normally used for prophetic utterances, Matthew excludes the possibility that Jesus is speaking of something that will occur. By using the aorist subjunctive, the action is occurring not only in the time that he's speaking, but it's continuing to occur. That is, Jesus' identity as the Son of Man, from Daniel's prophecy, if that's how we're going to understand it, is an ongoing enterprise. As far as the psychologizing aspect of what Ehrman appeals to in Schweitzer, then that just seems to somewhat beg the question. It seems to assume something that the text itself does not say. Now, what about Jesus identifying himself as the Son of Man?
And is it safe to say in this context, you're understanding Son of Man to be a different entity than Jesus himself?
Well, yeah, and I think he is. I mean, I think when he says this, it doesn't make any sense for Jesus to say, before you've gone through all the towns of Israel, I will come. So when Jesus talks about the coming of the Son of Man in the Gospels, in Matthew and Mark especially, but also in Luke and Q material and stuff, when he talks about the Son of Man in a variety of ways in the Gospels, sometimes he's just talking about himself. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Sometimes he's talking about how he's going to suffer. The Son of Man must go to Jerusalem and be rejected and be executed. But sometimes, and in those cases, he's clearly talking about himself. But in the Gospels, sometimes he talks about a figure coming from heaven, and almost certainly based on passage in Daniel chapter 7. And in those passages, there's nothing to suggest he's talking about him.
Now, the problem with this statement is that Jesus clearly attaches this term to himself. Another problem is we're reading something that Jesus says actually later in the Gospels at his trial before the high priest, when he identifies himself as that Son of Man and gets accused of blasphemy for doing so, is that we're taking that and reading it back into the text. So the question is, Matthew, as a gospel that's held largely as one that's speaking to a primarily Jewish audience, and one that had clearly defined beliefs about the identity of the Son of Man, especially as a divine figure. There's another aspect of this term as it's used, and I. Howard Marshall explains this in his entry in the Dictionary of Jesus in the Gospels regarding that title, Son of Man, which we may need to consider. Namely, there was a tendency among the sages and rabbis to use the phrase as a form of self-reference in cases where the speaker wished to show modesty or to speak of matters which were distasteful, in any case where he wished to avoid speaking in first person. He goes on to add that Son of Man is used by Jesus in this manner, and while Jesus uses it of himself, it never becomes attached to Jesus by his followers. Us, as modern Westerners and individualists, might think this way of self-reference is odd and unnatural. But in the ancient world, where humility was a prized value, this is simply a way of speaking that fits squarely within that milieu. And for more on this, you can see Bruce Molina's essay in Biblical Social Values and Their Meaning on humility. So, here's our question. How much of what Bart is saying is simply him reading his own desired conclusions into the text?
I was reading an article that John Collins sent me. He hadn't published yet. I don't know if he's published it since, but I would imagine it's somewhere online, where he's actually critiquing N.T. Wright's understanding of Mark. Now, I know we're dealing with Matthew, but this is an interesting point on how Matthew's dealing with this apocalyptic stuff later on in his gospel. He pretty much has this interesting passage that we're wondering if whoever wrote Mark actually wrote this, or if someone inserted it after the failed apocalypse never happened. And that is, well, not even the angels, not even the Son of Man. Well, he has this it's all about to happen, and then all of a sudden pump the brakes out of nowhere in mid thrust of it's about to happen, and then you got to go, well, just keep in mind, it's getting Jesus off the hook. How Matthew deals with this, do you see anything that is unique apocalyptic wise in Matthew's gospel as he's dealing with Mark's, I'll call it synoptic apocalypse, but what do you think?
Now, before I let Bart answer the question, the question is, of course, about the statement found in Matthew 24:36, which reads, "But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, only the Father." Now, a lot of hay has been made over this statement, especially given how the word that gets translated as knows is understood. And I've got an entire presentation on this text from Mark 13, which you can see here. But who's to say that our understanding is correct? Here again, we need to look at the context, specifically the fact that right before this, he's invoking the parable of the fig tree in verse 33. And he uses a verbal synonym there. When you see all these things, just like when Matthew or Mark's audience sees the evidence from the fig tree and deduces the coming of summer, it's analogous to the Father knowing, as an act of recognition on his part, that the time has come. But let's just hear what Bart has to say.
Well, Mark's synoptic apocalypse is chapter 13 of Mark. A lot of people don't realize that Mark doesn't have a lot of teaching of Jesus in comparison with Matthew or Luke or John. There are two main blocks of teaching in Mark. One is in chapter 4, where he tells some of his parables, and one is chapter 13, which is an apocalyptic discourse. And Matthew riffs on it. Matthew has a pretty similar apocalyptic view to Mark's. Matthew's apocalyptic discourse is 2 chapters. He doubles it, and and he's got a lot more stuff in there, but it's all pretty much, the end's coming, and you need to be ready, and you need to be prepared. And Matthew does presuppose that the end is coming after Jesus takes off, because you have these parables about, for example, people being given certain amounts of money while their master's away and they're supposed to invest their money. One of them just kind of takes it and hides it in his mattress. And when the master comes back, he's all ticked off because he didn't invest his money. And clearly this is about Jesus leaving and coming back and expecting you to have done something in his absence. And so, so Matthew's presupposing a post-Easter, as they say, situation, even more than Mark is. But he doesn't lessen the apocalyptic message at all. He heightens it, in contrast to Luke, who softens the apocalyptic message, and John, who gets rid of it.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
And this is one of the frustrating parts about interacting with Bart Ehrman, is he'll be asked a fairly direct question and then proceed to go off on an unrelated tangent. And there's a lot of things we can talk about here. For example, the statement is post-Easter. Duh. The entire New Testament is post-Easter because all of it is written in light of the resurrection. Yet, people, it does not follow that just because the Gospels are written, composed until after that time in particular, that a particular saying necessarily presupposes this. Moving along.
One of the big ones that always got me, and I'd love to get your comments, is talking about, then Jesus says to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world? We've heard this quoted a million times. Yet forfeit their soul. Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. What does that mean to you as a scholar?
Now, what we need to notice here is that the question is fundamentally subjective. It's not asking how we should or could understand the text as an objective reality. Rather, this question is asking for a subjective reaction from Ehrman. What's being ignored here is this is part of an extended scene that's meant to be contrasted against what's occurred earlier in chapter 16. Specifically, Peter's confession of Jesus as the Messiah. But let's just listen to how Ehrman responds.
I think part of this Jesus could not have said. So, the problem again is, you have this entire passage that's stringing together various sayings. And what scholars do, every scholar who works on this stuff does, is figure out if you've got an extended saying like that, are there parts of it that come from different sources? Are they representing different things? Part of this is clearly post-Easter, because when he says you have to take up your cross and follow me, that presupposes that Jesus has taken up his cross. And so it's written after, so that part comes after. But the idea that some of you standing here won't taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come in power, the Son of Man has come, depending on which gospel you read. I think that is historical. That's something that goes back to Jesus, and that he really expected the cosmic judge of the earth to arrive within his generation. This generation won't pass away before all these things take place. I think that really does go back to Jesus. And that's, this isn't just kind of my crazy idea, of course. This is the common view among historical scholars.
Here's the question. How do you know what Jesus did or didn't say? The instant you start attempting to weed out things that Jesus did or didn't say, it essentially becomes really subjective. Jesus says something you don't like, well, he didn't say it. Or he says something you do like, oh yeah, he said that. To say that Jesus could or couldn't have said something assumes you have some source that's outside of the New Testament or the gospel narratives by which to disconfirm it. If you got it, show it to me. Please, just pull it out and show it to me. The problem is that when people start doing this, what they're actually doing is exposing themselves and their presuppositions. It demonstrates that their objections are fundamentally theologically driven. Now, what we need to be ready to do is not only recognize that Ehrman and those like him often read what they want to into the text. Oh, sure, they'll attempt to mask it under some appeal to scholarly views. However, by careful engagement with the text, just by reading it in its context, such opinions can be demonstrated to be false on their face. Well, that's all for this video. Remember, you can follow me on X and Instagram at TriggerMan1976. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure and hit that thumbs up button. If you found it interesting, please share it with your friends. If you don't mind, hit that subscribe button. Again, I'm Sugarman1976. Thanks for watching.